We get started. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We're just giving it a minute to get folks on. Right. I think that's a good amount of people. So, all right. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar today. I'm really excited about this topic, and we're going to look more in depth about energy legislation in Illinois. And we have the best possible speakers you could get on this in the whole state. That's Ojars, Berzins, and Rep. Ann Williams. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But as many of you know, this is a series that we're doing. For those of you who are attorneys, you can get continuing legal education. And Hannah just put the sign in. We're going to put that a few times. You got to be able to fill this out by the time this is over. We also will follow up with a recording and materials and a survey about this CLE. So please fill that out. But this is going to be accessible to anybody that is on, and a real learning experience. We've been through a lot in the last many years about energy legislation. And so I'm going to pitch this off to our speakers now to talk about their backgrounds and then start sharing their presentation. So thanks. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll kick it off. Thanks everyone for being here today, and Jen for hosting us. My name is Ann Williams. I'm an assistant majority leader in the Illinois House and in my 8th term. I chaired the Energy and Environment Committee until this year, where I chaired the exec committee, but I'm still pretty engaged in the energy space and working as a co-lead on the House Energy Working Group. And very excited today to be here, and I'll kick it over to Ojars.
Everyone, thanks again for hosting, Jen. I'm really excited to do this with you, Leader Williams. My name is Ojars Berzins. I'm a lobbyist and policy advisor working as managing director for McFadden Strategies and as state policy consultant for the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. Previously, I worked as senior assistant counsel to the speaker, where I staffed a lot of energy legislation in the wake of CEJA, and I got to work alongside Leader Williams for all of that, spending 3 sessions as staffer for the Energy Environment Committee. I'm excited to talk to you all today about the unique dynamics in the state in negotiating and drafting energy legislation. And I'm going to share my screen and get it.
Great, thank you, Ojars. So I'm going to do the first part of the presentation and focus a little more on the kind of evolution of how we draft and negotiate energy legislation in Illinois. It's kind of a part insider view of what goes on and part of a walk down memory lane for those of you who are engaged and involved in some of these issues over the years. So certainly there have been several energy related bills passed during my tenure in the General Assembly. I'm going to focus on more recent legislation, starting with the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was passed in December of 2016. Then moving on to the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, passed in September 2021. Touch briefly on the regulation of carbon capture and sequestration, passed in July of 2024. And then talking this year about an omnibus energy bill conversation that was heavily negotiated, but didn't make it across the finish line, mainly due to lack of time. But that is an ongoing work in progress. So my focus today will be on how the process works, and it certainly has evolved significantly in the last several years during my tenure in the GA. I will provide a quick caveat. This is my perspective as a rank and file legislator for most of my tenure, and this is what I've observed, so others may have a slightly different view. But I would say before FEJA, so before 2016, the stakeholders that were most involved in the discussion and decisions on energy legislation were, quite frankly, business and industry, including utilities and generators. The environmental community did engage and be involved to the extent of their ability to do so. But again, the focus was industry. And while the community was developing a growing presence and relevance in the capital every year, thanks to the hard work of the member organizations of the Illinois Environmental Council and the commitment and dedication to keep pushing, they were not always given a seat at the table. And environmental concerns often were on the back burner as to what industry was seeking. And that's something that I saw for the beginning of my time in the General Assembly. Then in 2014, Obama developed his Clean Power Plan, and that kind of kicked off a big change in Illinois. And a large group of environmental advocacy organizations, community leaders, community activists, EJ groups, faith-based and student organizations joined together to create a powerful coalition to advocate for public health and the environment, protect consumers, and create clean and equitable jobs throughout the state. And if you recognize that mission statement, it's because that is the mission statement of the Clean Jobs Coalition. So CJC was involved in the passage of CEJA, and its member organizations were instrumental in getting some strong environmental protections into the bill. And we didn't see the full force, though, of the CJC until the years predating the passage of CEJA. And that was a game changer in Illinois. I cannot overstate the role that CJC has and continues to play in shaping Illinois energy policy. And as the GA evolves and more legislators are elected who have an environmental focus and environmental foundation, the role and power of the CJC likewise increases. So it could be a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario here, but either way, it's working. So as I said, the discussion of energy policy in Illinois has really evolved significantly since FEJA. So to some extent in FEJA, and certainly in the energy bills preceding FEJA, legislators were largely cut out of the negotiations of these large energy packages, having it very driven by the top. My talking points, in fact, after the passage of CEJA noted that the process was so different. And I would comment that prior to CEJA, most energy bills were negotiated literally in the conference room of the utility companies. And I think this was on point and pretty accurate. We did see, sadly, the recent federal trials provided some additional insight into the process under the former speaker for the passage of energy legislation. And of course, it looks much different under our current speaker, Speaker Welch. But with CEJA, the process had evolved quite a bit and looked a lot different. So in my opinion, and I don't know if others would agree, but I'm guessing they would, CEJA really marked the beginning of a new and dynamic approach to creating energy policy in Illinois. So with CEJA, inside the negotiating room, the House and Senate leaders appointed 2 members to be lead negotiators, one from the House and one from the Senate. And various members of the House and Senate were also in the negotiating room, as well as representatives from the governor's office, the attorney general, the EPA, and the ICC, all joined by industry and environmental stakeholders to hammer out the details of what became a nation-leading piece of legislation. Keep in mind, this extensive negotiation from beginning to end took over 3 years, literally many dozens and dozens of meetings, Zoom calls. Many got nowhere. In fact, I recall one negotiating session where it was a Zoom call, and I think there were over 100 participants. Certainly not the best climate or environment for a positive resolution of a complicated subject matter, but that's kind of what happened in the years leading up and building momentum for the passage of CEJA. So for me, it was a pretty monumental, though, because for the first time as an environmental leader in the House, I was there as part of the process in the passage of CEJA, and I worked closely with the CJC to advance the bill through many ups and downs before we got it across the finish line. A few false starts and stops, but wow, it was a wild ride. So, we hadn't seen it at this level before, but the Clean Jobs Coalition was working hard outside the negotiating room to advance the bill and developed a very robust campaign that would serve as a blueprint for future energy bill campaigns and launched the organization and its members into a central role for all future energy discussions, where they remain quite a leader today. So the CJC campaign really was unprecedented in my experience. I had never seen like anything that organized and that powerful from the environmental community. Collaboration really does work, and it was so unique. First of all, they developed a model that provided that they introduced their version of the particular legislation. So the first bill they introduced was called the Clean Energy Jobs Act. It was actually filed under my name, and I had the honor of sponsoring that bill and starting it and kicking it off in the process in the House. And the reason for this was really to lay down a marker, creating a foundation in content and scope for the energy bill that would follow. And I thought it was a very effective strategy, a good tool to build a coalition around, energize the grassroots, get legislators engaged. So the final version, of course, was heavily negotiated and looked a lot different than the initial CEJA. But we had our wish list out there, and it was a great starting point for negotiations. And I think provided us kind of a natural advantage after years of our voices being a bit marginalized in the energy conversations. And if you've been around the energy space for any time at all, you know that our use of acronyms is quite ubiquitous. And the final CEJA bill was actually called Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, still CEJA. So kudos to whoever came up with that nickname, because we were able to keep our materials in place and keep building on the momentum that we had around CEJA, 1.0 all the way to CEJA 2.0. So the CJ also, as part of this process, embarked upon what they entitled the Listen, Lead, Share Tour. And they went statewide to communities throughout the state, hosting town hall meetings, engaging local legislators, community leaders, faith organization, and really tried to determine what local areas, what local communities were looking for in terms of their clean energy future. And it was a powerful exercise, and it went on for, I think, a year or two. This process also served to engage these organizations so that later it was invaluable to have them already engaged and ready to step up and advance and fight for the issues that we thought were most important to include in the final package. Also significantly, and I think a very impactful component of the work and the process here, was the engagement of CJC in an unprecedented PR and grassroots advocacy campaign. Basically, the goal was to push for a comprehensive clean energy bill, but it contained all the elements of a successful and professional issue-based campaign. It was strategic. We branded. They coordinated materials and fact sheets, held virtual town halls with catchy materials and slogans, but easy to understand PowerPoints that members could take back to their own communities and host, therefore creating a sense of ownership with both grassroots advocates and members themselves. We had press conferences, press releases, videos for members to share on their own social media toolkits, media appearances, editorials, editorial board visits, sign-on letters, sponsor media support, outreach to constituents via text campaigns, etc. A multi-pronged approach was used, and wow, it was effective. I'm sure I missed a few tools there, but suffice it to say, CEJA became a household word in the General Assembly in the years leading up to its passage, and it made a difference in pushing for the issues that we cared about as an environmental community. It was a sight to behold. It was amazing, and it really continues to be a model for campaigns moving forward and subsequent energy bills, and quite effective. So if you were there for the ride, and I know many of you were, after years of hard work, effort, and collaboration, our nation-leading Climate and Equitable Jobs Act was finally passed. And what a day that was, and indulge me a little as I walked down memory lane. The bill was signed on a beautiful sunny day outside the Shedd Aquarium with a backdrop of beautiful Lake Michigan. All the stakeholders were there, environmentalists, labor, and business partners, leading legislators. And for me personally, it was a very significant day because it marked the first time in my career that I was part of the process. And I know a lot of others felt the same way. So it was a really important kind of watershed moment, I think, in terms of how we looked at creating energy policy in Illinois. So moving forward, every bill since CEJA has involved a robust and finally legislator-driven process, which reflected a diverse group of stakeholder and community engagement. Of course, each energy bill looks and feels very different, but the negotiations to regulate carbon capture were unique in their own way. And carbon capture and sequestration, you may recall, was getting momentum because of the federal tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. That meant more and more industry players were looking to locate in Illinois to do the CCS. And it was absolutely unregulated, and they were going to proceed one way or the other. So taking the governor's lead, we decided, embarked upon an effort to create a regulatory structure for CCS technology. Once again, I introduced a version of the bill supported by my friends in the environmental community, and of course, different industry players also introduced their own versions. As was the case for most energy bill negotiations, the final successful negotiation followed a period of not so effective discussions, which were not so productive. But this particular negotiation got a lot of engagement by the governor's office, and they were committed to establishing a regulatory framework to really facilitate the influx of companies responding to the IRA tax credits. The setup of the negotiation process was led by Deputy Governor Bria Scudder, and I have to give her a shout out. She ran a tight and very effective process. Basically, what she did, again, was very legislator driven, very focused on stakeholder input. She created a negotiating table, but broke us into subgroups to tackle certain perspectives and certain components of the CCS process. And larger meetings would then reconvene to discuss different components of the bill. So the groups where stakeholders were sent off to rooms far and wide to kind of come to agreement on particular components. And the larger group would reconvene. And if there wasn't consensus reached, the larger group and other stakeholders, legislators, would assist the stakeholders and push them to come to an agreement. This proved really effective for an intense, shorter term negotiation. And this took place, the final component, where we met several times a day, several times a week at the end of the 2024 legislative session. And before the bill was passed, we created what we felt was the strongest in the nation regulatory framework for CCS technology, a previously unregulated industry. And I have to credit the governor's office and particularly Deputy Governor Scudder for her talent and skill in navigating a complex topic like this and getting us to a successful resolution literally in a few weeks after kind of years of or months of meandering conversations. So that bill, and Ojars put up a graphic here about details. I won't get into those today since we're focused on process, but it was a complicated topic, and I learned more about carbon capture, geology, and than I ever expected to in that short period of time. So it was a complex and complicated topic, but the difference is it was a very single a topic too, singular topic, unlike some of the energy legislation that we're seeing more recently. So if you're involved in Springfield or are a watcher of what happens in Springfield in the legislative arena, you're familiar with the omnibus packages that are utilized for big issues like gaming, like cannabis, and many others. But in recent years, the GA has truly begun to look at energy bills in a comprehensive and holistic way by focusing on the omnibus legislative process rather than passing unique individual bills. So, in many ways, this makes sense. We have the same stakeholders usually involved, same general topic areas, same legislators engaged, and usually the same staff. We have a lot of diverse interest on the slide: advocacy groups, organized laborers, utility, the energy industry, manufacturers, any number of stakeholders organizing around these same topics. And of course, if you put a lot of diverse interests looking to achieve an outcome in one bill, there's more need to compromise and more opportunity for leverage. So some of the pros I've noticed about doing a comprehensive omnibus-like approach is it creates kind of a take it or leave it option for legislators. So that makes it easier to pass. Maybe there's a few things in the bill you don't love, but overall, the benefits of the bill make it worth your vote. Compromise is absolutely part of the game in an omnibus package. And when we do finally arrive at a package, while it may not be 100% absolutely, totally agreed, usually we have all major stakeholders involved and on board, at least to a position of neutral. And they are able to help lobby the bill and get it across the finish line with the message that, hey, if the environmental community, if labor and business and industry are basically in agreement, it must be a good bill and worthy of passage. The cons, of course, are that these negotiations can be very sweeping in terms of topic and scope. They are incredibly complex. Ojars can attest to that fact. I think you had to go from 0 to 60 in terms of learning the energy space. They're extremely time consuming and there are a lot of moving parts. It's almost like a constant game of whack-a-mole. Once you resolve one issue and get one group on board and comfortable with a particular topic or language, you have another group that causes them to remove their support. So it's constantly changing. Of course, omnibus bills require a ton of staff support and really significant commitment from legislators and stakeholders. So as crazy as a legislative session can get for organizations, legislators, and staff, you really have to focus and be committed in order to get an energy bill across the finish line. Another challenge in the category of cons is that the bills can be easily derailed if just one major stakeholder pulls their support on a particular issue. So most stakeholders have to make significant compromises in order to reap significant benefits in an omnibus, and many of them have to go back to their boards, or in the case of CJC, to their member organizations, and many have a process for approval or getting to neutral. So they can be very, very cumbersome. But I would say a case in point would be the most recent energy negotiations in Springfield. And once again, following our model, I introduced the Clean and Reliable Grid Act. SURGA was the nickname. And we filed this bill to maximize energy efficiency, build transmission, address resource adequacy, and keep energy bills in check. And we started along the process. The process was in place. The stakeholders were engaged, the same folks we have listed here. And we had a working group comprised of a small group of legislators, governor's office, the capable folks at the ICC and the IPA. And we met diligently throughout session, early morning meetings, late night conversations, emails at all hours. Unfortunately, though, as it goes typically and frequently with the large energy packages, we basically ran out of time to get anything across the finish line this spring. But process-wise, I do still feel very positive about it. It still has continued to evolve, and I think we've landed on a winning kind of formula for the consideration and the negotiation of energy bills. Even though we didn't get this particular bill across the finish line at this point, we did make significant progress in a lot of areas. We neutralized many opponents. We had numerous conversations and got to consensus in places a lot of us never thought we would see it. So the process now involved for the SURJA generated bill, a core working group again who met regularly. And then we created several topical subgroups, again, to hash out particular topics with relevant stakeholders, kind of like the process we used for the CCS. But because the topics were much broader and more all-encompassing, the topics included very, very broad topics for the subgroups: energy efficiency and peak load reduction, data centers, the hot topic this year, the topic du jour, I would say, around the Capitol, transmission expansion, streamlining energy connection, energy storage, among others. Those groups would meet regularly and report back with legislators to the core group, where we'd make decisions, kind of go through a checklist of where we wanted to land. So certainly the process I just described is not always immediately impactful or successful, and very time consuming, very labor intensive. But I think this comes with the territory. And when we take up the energy conversation again, it will be after consumers have, unfortunately, likely seen rate increases in their bills this summer. And so the stakes will be even higher to address capacity and affordability. So I do feel confident we will move forward on this. And for the record, we did make amazing progress in so many areas, and we don't plan to start from scratch. We will be picking up where we left off, which will hopefully put us ahead of the game. So in conclusion, as I reflect upon the evolution of the policy for energy, the energy policy making process since I've been in office, we've really seen a significant, and I believe, very, very positive evolution of the conversation. So literally, instead of being crafted in the industry conference rooms, it's being shaped by democratically elected legislators, putting in the work, working closely with the input of stakeholders and community leaders, and really trying to collaborate on what's best for the climate and for our communities. So it's not easy. Creating good policy in a collaborative, inclusive way, which puts communities at the forefront, can certainly be challenging, time-consuming, labor-intensive, you name it. It is exhausting. I can attest to that. I'm still recovering from the last few weeks of session. And sure, it was a lot easier back in the day when the bill was written in the back room, put out on the board with little time to vet it, very little time for input or critique. But those days are behind us. So just like democracy is messy, so is passing a democratically elected a bill supported by democratically elected officials to create new and innovative energy policies. So it's not easy, but we're in a place, I think, that the energy conversation is ongoing. We seem to be engaged, I think, in almost kind of a rolling working group process that's really designed to address issues as they arise. And of course, as we are all painfully aware, in light of the instability and unpredictability on the federal level, we really need to be able to stand ready to meet these challenges as they come, making sure we ensure the grid is reliable, that our energy is affordable, and we always have climate at the forefront. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ojars to get involved with some of the more nitty-gritty of crafting energy legislation in Illinois.
Thanks, Rep. That was really insightful. As we go through this really complicated process, with so many cooks in the kitchen, especially nowadays, it's really important that the legislative drafters have an understanding of some of the key legal principles that are going to underpin not just legislation in general in Illinois, but especially energy legislation, which often touches on a lot of interstate and federal issues. So this is a very simplistic list of policies here. But what's important, if you're one of those drafters, is knowing how to orient yourself within the Illinois compiled statutes. So the Illinois compiled statutes is organized by the three major energy agencies that regulate energy law in Illinois. So that would be the Illinois Power Agency Act, the Public Utilities Act, governed by the ICC, and the Environmental Protection Act. If you're concerned about whether union labor is being used to build transmission lines, or you're concerned about procuring solar energy on schools, that's going to require you to assess a very different part of the law than if you're interested in regulating gas plants situated next to historically disadvantaged communities. So all of these policy areas are going to have different places in the compiled statutes that you'll find them, and hopefully drafters are using environmental justice as a lens to view any sort of new policy that they are negotiating and drafting. So legislative drafting follows a different path for energy legislation than for a typical bill that's going to be introduced in January, and that's why I include this silly example for all of the reasons that Rep. Williams neatly covered. So often omnibus packages and highly negotiated legislation is going to be filed on shell bills or vehicle bills like this one. A shell bill or a vehicle bill is legislation that has been introduced either with the specific intent that it will be used for something that is negotiated and then later introduced later on in the legislative process, or something that is a bill that is passed from one chamber to the next that then will not be advancing to the governor's desk, so it is shelled, and it looks like this. For example, this is the text of SB 40, which was the Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act, the energy omnibus package, prior to the contents of that package being put on the bill. So this is done. Leaders file hundreds of these every year for procedural flexibility under the requirements that are posed by the Constitution and House and Senate rules. Nonetheless, drafters need to have a number of key principles in mind that's going to be important for any energy legislation that's drafted. So we're going to start with the state constitution. Now, this is a pretty niche area of law. I went to Loyola for law school here in Chicago, and I got a great legal education, but we did not touch on state case law and the state constitution. I didn't learn that until I started working for the House Democratic staff. So starting with the passage of bills, broadly speaking, a bill needs to be read by title on 3 different days in each house. This is why leaders will rely on shell bills and vehicle bills to be able to advance their legislation. Otherwise, you're negotiating for months and weeks on end, and you could run out of time, literally, in the last couple of days if you have to introduce a brand new bill. So they can use a bill that has been already introduced and file that legislation onto that bill. Next, the single subject rule. This is not as black and white as the quote would suggest. Bills, except for bills for appropriations and for the codification, revision, or rearrangement of laws, shall be confined to one subject. The legislature actually has a lot of leeway in determining this. And there are certain bills with procedural or functional through lines, like the Budget Implementation Bill, or commonly known as the BIMP, or the Legislative Reference Bureau Revisory Bill, which corrects everyone's typos and missed references that are not going to be impacted by the single subject rule. If you're ever curious about what the LRB Revisory Bill is, please feel free to ask me. It's a very strange read. And we had to look at that and review on staff each year. Next, special legislation. The General Assembly cannot pass a special or local law when general law can be made. This is often mischaracterized by opposition to bills. This is used to prevent arbitrary classifications, is the intent of this rule. So there's a 2-part test that any legislation is going to be subject to see if it is special legislation. First, you have to determine, is the classification based on a rational difference or condition? And second, is there a rational basis for the classification that has been made? If you're an attorney, you know that rational basis is going to afford a lot of deference to the legislature. But nonetheless, special legislation, you need to have this in mind. Know that this is a key constitutional principle that has been litigated extensively, and subject whatever you're writing to this 2-part test. Now, you might notice, if you've read a lot of energy legislation, stylistic differences that are used in drafting. So legislation, for example, could refer to a county neighboring Lake Michigan with 2 million or fewer residents. This can only apply to Lake County, but that is just a stylistic drafting choice. That is not single-handedly absolve the legislation of consideration under special legislation. So just keep that in mind. And I always love examples of how the legislature has narrowed these different localities down over time. Finally, but not the least important, are the effective date of laws. So this is especially important now that the legislative session has wrapped, and May 31st has passed. So a bill passed after that time cannot become effective prior to June 1st of the next year unless the GA has a 3/5 vote. So this becomes a both political and policy consideration that drafters and negotiators are going to have to consider. Does your bill have to be effective immediately? If so, you're going to have more votes. And if so, you're going to have to pass your bill either during a veto, special, or lame duck session. The default effective date is also important to know. If your bill is passing before June 1st, it's going to be effective on January 1st of the next year. If your bill passes on or after June 1st, June 1st of the next year is the default effective date. Now, in addition to state constitutional law, there are a few basic federal legal principles and related principles to keep in mind, including the Dormant Commerce Clause, federal preemption by federal law and federal agencies, and the Takings Clause, which we won't get into in this presentation, but I would just be wary of anything that could seize property without proper compensation. Additionally, the state constitution gives special power to home rule units of local government, but these can still be regulated. Just keep an eye out for how they're being regulated. The paragraph that is used in the legislative draft is going to determine whether or not that requires a 3/5 vote by the legislature. So the Dormant Commerce Clause, one of the most important principles to keep in mind as you go forward and start drafting your legislation, especially if it is power sector legislation, or if it deals with electric transmission, for example. So here are a few key cases to guide you. Broadly, the Dormant Commerce Clause guards against economic protectionism and discrimination between states. So the city of Philadelphia v. New Jersey is a key case that I learned about in law school. Here, the state of New Jersey banned states from importing trash into New Jersey. This had become a huge problem. Philadelphia, New York City, neighboring states all had their trash imported into New Jersey, where landfills, there was a lot more space for landfills than around Philadelphia, around New York City, for example. So the state decided to ban this. They were going to ban the importation of any waste or of a lot of the waste or trash importation into the state. And this violated the Dormant Commerce Clause. So you'll see from the quotes here, what's important is the attempt by the state to isolate itself from a common problem by erecting a barrier against the movement of interstate trade. Broadly, states cannot engage in this kind of protectionism the way that countries can. For example, states in Illinois cannot issue tariffs on energy from Kentucky or from Missouri. That's not allowed. And it's because of the Dormant Commerce Clause. Now, these next two cases, we won't get into a lot of detail on, but these are examples of challenges to state RPS programs, and we have one of those in Illinois as well, reiterating the fundamental principles that drafters need to have in mind as you draft energy legislation. So ICC versus FERC dealt with a challenge to the Michigan RPS, and it reiterated this principle that you cannot discriminate against out-of-state companies and interests. Energy and Environment Legal Institute v. Apple was a Colorado case where plaintiffs unsuccessfully argued that the RPS in Colorado violated the extraterritoriality doctrine of the Dormant Commerce Clause. That's a reminder to neatly tailor your policy to what actually occurs within the state, because that is what the state has purview over. So what can you do? There are a number of exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause that have been heavily litigated and are part of case law. So the state can act as a market participant. If Illinois decides that they want to manufacture and sell their own solar panels, they cannot require people in Illinois to buy those solar panels, or not ban the sale of rooftop solar panels from other states into Illinois. What they can do is act as a market participant. The state could offer could create a good and put it into the flow of commerce and let the market decide who buys what. Congress can authorize states to do certain things that otherwise would be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. But this is something that's going to have to happen on the federal level, and it's going to be really difficult for that to change anytime in the near future. And finally, states can incidentally burden interstate commerce. This is the Pike balancing test, which we don't have time to get into today, but something to be aware of. Your legislation can incidentally burden interstate commerce, but it cannot be something that is so overt and obvious and designed to burden out-of-state companies. So maybe you can't mandate the use of in-state companies for the state RPS. What you can do is have labor standards in place that will maybe guide what companies, what contractors are able to work on renewable energy development within the state. Now, FERC and interstate commerce, I've included a few bullet points here about things that FERC has jurisdiction over. You should know that federal grid regulators have jurisdiction over what they have jurisdiction over, and know that most of the time the state is not going to be able to regulate this. FERC has broad powers to regulate transmission and to regulate how, and notably how long, it takes to connect new projects to the grid. So the state can exercise some concurrent powers here, but it can't usurp FERC here. So FERC will be regulating transmission and sale of electricity, mergers and acquisitions, certain pipeline regulations, though the state does have the ability to regulate oil and gas pipelines and CCS pipelines, notably within the state. But once that takes on some kind of interstate element, that's where this is going to careful analysis of both federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause are going to come into play. And it's going to be really important to be conscious of that. So an example from the field a couple of years ago, which Leader Williams and I got to work on, was the right of first refusal. So FERC Rule 1000 and 5,000-foot view on this eliminated the federal right of first refusal for incumbent utilities, opened the door for states to be able to issue their own ROFR to build electric transmission lines. This was proposed in Illinois by the electrical workers and Ameren, and later I believe ComEd also supported this. It was introduced towards the end of session in 2023. It passed the legislature, and then Governor Pritzker vetoed ROFR. And after the veto, the legislature considered a number of alternatives, mostly related to labor standards and protecting the work that occurs within the state. But this has a fundamental interstate element to it. And so careful analysis of both federal preemption and the Dormant Commerce Clause were necessary. So a number of alternatives were drafted up in the months that followed. But we had to make sure that both, the state stayed within its purview and did not end up regulating work that originated in Iowa or in Wisconsin and flowed into Illinois. And so the state did not end up pursuing a ROFR alternative in that veto session in 2023. However, in the lame duck bill that passed in January, you can see a sort of corollary to ROFR that protects union workers in the state working on electric transmission, and that deals mostly with labor and safety standards. So in sum, there's been a lot that's happened since CEJA, and I felt really lucky to work alongside Rep. Williams on a lot of different legislation. Solar, wind, and siting required careful analysis of local elements and making sure that both, practically speaking, municipalities, counties, and localities were heard in this process, but the state had purview to be able to regulate siting of renewable energy projects in the state. CCS required drafting to be concurrent with federal regulations, and we spent a lot of time going through what federal regulations looked like and what the state could do, and eventually balance local and state issues. Nuclear energy, right of first refusal, and SURJA all dealt with legislation that has had and issues that have had an interstate component to them. So in sum, if you're going to negotiate and draft energy legislation in the state, there's a lot to keep in mind because this is fundamentally complicated. And so, Rep, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add before we open it up to questions.
No, thanks for the overview.
Great.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat, but folks, maybe we should, Kit asked a question that Anne answered in the Q&A, but maybe we could say it verbally as well. So Kit asked a question, how do legislators get on the working group for an omnibus bill? Is it self-selection or an assignment process? Do you want to answer that out loud?
Sure. So it varies from session to session, and it's kind of evolved as well. So for CEJA, the bill, the bigger energy conversation was led by leaders Hoffman in the House and Leader Cunningham in the Senate. And people do kind of become experts in the subject area based on the committees they chair or bills that they sponsor. So sometimes sponsoring a bill can involve you in the conversation, and that's always something to keep in mind. But I would say what I told the person asked the question was, our house in the House itself, the Speaker assigned 4 members of the leadership team to be co-leads. So it's not a working group per se, but more of a co-lead process. And that's Majority Leader Gable and Assistant Majority Leaders Jay Hoffman, Marcus Evans, and myself. And I think the Senate uses their chairs. So in the Senate, it's Steve Stottleman, who chairs the Energy Committee, Laura Ellman, who chairs the Environment Committee, and Bill Cunningham from the leadership perspective. But one thing I did note is it enables us to engage with members of our caucus and share their perspectives with the larger group and keep that in mind as we're negotiating the bills. So it really is a collaborative process, and part of our role is to engage with other members of our caucus to share their priorities.
Great, and I see some more questions, but I love this question from Annika. Hopefully you all are comfortable answering it. Because I think there's definitely an impact, and if you want me to add to this as well, I will. But I'd love to know what impact you think, well, she said Madigan corruption had on the prior energy legislative process. But I wonder if you want to compare pre-Madigan to post-Madigan in terms of energy negotiations and legislation.
Yeah, that's pretty much kind of the focus, kind of what I was trying to convey. It felt a lot different. There were several energy bills passed between when I was sworn in 2011 and 2016 when FEJA, those darn acronyms, when FEJA passed. And I wasn't really aware of any of those, despite the fact that I was engaged and on the energy committees and involved with, I was chair of the Green Caucus for many of those years. So when I said they were negotiated in the conference rooms of the utility companies, that was my experience. I don't exactly know how they all evolved, but unfortunately we had a little bit of an insight into the process through the federal trial. So I have to give credit to Speaker Welch. We have such a legislator-driven process now. I have been involved with every piece of legislation as former chair of the Green Caucus and as chair of the Energy and Environment Committee. I don't know what it's like from an advocacy perspective, but I imagine it's the same because we work so closely together. So I'm sure we always need to do more to improve the process. But again, it's from my perspective, dramatically different.
Yeah, and I've always thought that from the perspective, Speaker Madigan liked things to end in 5 or 10 years so that people would have to come back and renegotiate. And I'm not sure that we ever would have gotten 2050 or 2045 as a date with the speaker in place because it was too far away. So that's me inserting my opinion into your CLE. Um, Ojars, did you want to add anything? Otherwise, I'll go to these next ones.
We can move on to the next one.
Oh, okay. Leah Goodman asked a question, what part of this process is the hardest, and how can local elected leaders make the most impact?
Did you say local elected leaders?
So I think maybe she's talking about local elected officials, municipal, county,
Yeah.
or yeah, well, local elected leaders, yeah.
I have said this publicly before and probably on a different CLE in the past, but the reason that CEJA was so successful is not attributable to the legislators or even the lobbyists that worked on the bill. It's the effort and engagement of grassroots advocacy organizations. Local elected officials were owning the issue of CEJA. They were engaging in the process. They were contacting their legislators. They were sharing information about CEJA on social media. So the engagement and the ownership of these issues at all levels of government is critical. Each of you represent an important constituency that members need to feel that their local communities, both the representatives and the residents themselves, are supportive of these big sweeping policy issues. So your engagement on the local level is really, really significant and really helpful in getting bills like this across the finish line.
Great. For both of you, what do you see as the most critical energy-related policy issue that will confront the General Assembly in the coming years?
Well, there's a new there's a new area of focus and priority. I feel like every day I'm interested in Oyar's opinion because he's now working in that space every single day. But I'll say that, I referenced the data centers this year. That was kind of the topic du jour. Every year there's something everyone's talking about. So throughout the day when we were down in Springfield for the session, different legislators, some engaged in the energy space, some not engaged at all, would say, hey, what's going on with these data centers? Everyone's talking about the data centers. What are you guys doing on that? What are you hearing? We want, someone come up and say, we want data centers. We want to clear the way, make sure we can build these data centers, bring jobs. Others would get up and say, we got to make sure they pay their fair share. We don't want to open it up for industry without, having them bring their own energy to the table. So those kind of conversations were really helpful. And any topic that legislators are talking about becomes a hot topic for us. So things like energy storage, transmission, resource adequacy, I'm sure rates are going to be a very big topic of conversation in the fall session.
Big time agree with Rep. Williams on all of that. I would just say in general, though, CEJA passed about 2 months before I started working with the legislature. But everything that we've done since has been framed by CEJA. And CEJA kind of represented both in a very actual legal sense and also symbolically a hard and serious commitment to 100% renewable energy within the state. And now the state has to fulfill that promise. And unfortunately, the federal government has tried really hard to curtail renewable energy development. And in addition to actions by the Trump administration, regional transmission organizations have made it really hard to connect projects to the grid. Fortunately, the state has a lot of tools at its disposal that we can do. That's why the Clean Jobs Coalition introduced SURJA. And I think going beyond that, we're gonna have to look at a lot of different ways that we can end up responding to regional and federal entities that are just trying to make it as hard as possible to have us fulfill our goals.
And of course, it's not really under the topic of energy per se, but I know the Clean Jobs Coalition was very focused and engaged on transit this year, which I think I've received upwards of 1,500 emails in my office. So also promises to be a very important topic for those focused on environmental issues.
Definitely. I think we'll keep asking questions, you guys, and I think Ojars, this goes perfectly into what you were previously answering, but can you talk about what leverage, if any, a state has over the grid operators like PJM that operate interstate? It seems like they are a bottleneck as well as potentially part of the solution.
Yeah, that's interesting and kind of a tough question to answer, just because federal and regional entities are going to have a lot of jurisdiction over what the state can do. But regional transmission organizations are a voluntary organization. They have not existed forever. About 20, 25 years ago, the state or regions in the state entered PJM and MISO. These are not set in stone. These entities have changed a lot. They have their own policies. And frankly, and hopefully PJM and MISO will see that their policies are making it more difficult for renewable projects to connect to the grid. We can pressure them to try to change their policies and make it easier to do so. One of the things that the Energy Omnibus package contemplated was a study on Illinois forming its own RTO. I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of that. And I think a study would be really useful to figure that out, right? But it's important for these organizations to know what our priorities are as a state. And I think, there are a lot of tools at our disposal that we could ultimately try to use to effectuate that.
Really great. Yeah, there's a question about AI data centers near Memphis and Birmingham have shown what a huge energy need is added to things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, et cetera, like grids, transmission, infrastructure, et cetera. Sabrina is asking where the coal or gas or alternative energy are coming from for current data centers. So, I mean, this might be a place, Ojars, to go into a little bit of Beyonce.
Yeah, so I'm so happy. I don't remember who in the ICJC came up with Beyonce as the acronym, but our policy that we wanted the state to adopt was bring your own new clean energy. And that's because all across the country, data centers are adding a ton of demand to the grid. They're competing with the same supply that our new renewable generation is trying to compete with to get onto the grid, and these outdated and frankly, broken policy levers that regional transmission organizations have decided to lift. What we wanted the state to do, and what we're going to keep pushing for very hard in the coming months, is making sure that if these data centers want to come to the state, we would love to have their economic benefits, but we also want to make sure that they are contributing to our commitment to a renewable future by bringing their own or paying for renewable energy generation in the state.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I didn't know about the acronym Beyonce until just now. And wow, amazing. I'll be using that throughout the day, any chance I can. But yes, I think what OERs is saying is really accurate. We need to really strike a balance. And that's part of the goal of having such a diverse coalition working group of stakeholders working on these bills so we can hear all the perspectives and really find that right balance.
Yeah, this was perfect. So Hannah's going to put the CLE link in one more time. So make sure you fill it out if you want that. And we'll follow up the certificate soon. But for Chair Williams and OERs, thank you so much for this really delightful presentation. I think it really breaks down the process and opens it up and helps people with an understanding of how our policy is made, which is, it's supposed to be sausage, but I feel like you guys are making some nice cookies. So we're watching the process and we're going to end up with a really delightful reward at the end. So thank you for what you're doing. And thanks to everybody who attended. We will follow up with the slides and the recording. So thanks and have a really great afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.